Have you ever been turned away from the one place you believed would shelter you? That crushing weight of rejection, the bewilderment of closed doors when you are most vulnerable. These are wounds that cut deeper than any physical pain. Today's story takes us into the heart of such rejection, but it carries within it a luminous truth about grace, sacrifice, and the mysterious ways compassion can transform even the hardest hearts. Prepare yourself for tears, for unexpected turns, and for a revelation about the power of forgiveness that might just change how you see the world. Cold rain traced rivers down Timothy's face as he stood before the towering gates. Orphanage doors locked tight, woman's gaze severe. The wood was dark, almost black with age and weather, and the iron bolts across the double gates seemed to declare an absolute verdict. The boy was small for his 11 years, thin in a way that spoke of recent hardship rather than chronic poverty. His grey woolen shirt hung loose on narrow shoulders, and his canvas trousers were darkened at the knees from kneeling in mud. No coat, no bag. Only a small wooden cross clutched in his left hand, its edges worn smooth from constant handling. His brown hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes, those clear, honest eyes, looked up at the narrow window set into the gate where a woman's face appeared, framed by the wooden aperture like a portrait of judgment itself. The woman was perhaps 60 years of age, her features carved into permanent severity by decades of managing difficult circumstances. Her hair was pulled back beneath a black bonnet, and her high-collared dress was equally dark, giving her the appearance of a raven perched in its nest. Her name was Beatrice Ashford, and she was the director of St. Margaret's Orphanage for Displaced Children, an institution that had stood on this hill overlooking the valley for 97 years. She had run it for the last 23, and in that time she had learned to make hard decisions quickly. She had to. Resources were limited, space was scarce, and sentiment was a luxury she could not afford. "Name," she said, her voice carrying through the rain without warmth. "Timothy Brennan, ma'am." His voice was steady despite the trembling in his hands. "Age." 11 years and 7 months, ma'am. "Parents." The pause was brief but heavy. "Deceased, ma'am, both of them. 3 weeks ago. The fever." Beatrice's lips pressed into a thinner line. Fever had swept through the valley that autumn, claiming dozens. The orphanage had been fortunate, no outbreaks within their walls, and she intended to keep it that way. "Have you been examined by a physician?" she asked. "No, ma'am. We couldn't afford—" "Then you cannot enter." The words were final, absolute. "We have 42 children inside these walls, Mr. Brennan. I will not risk their health for one boy who may be carrying disease. The quarantine period is 14 days. If you can prove you have been healthy for that duration and have been examined by a qualified doctor, you may return." Timothy's throat worked, but he did not cry. He had learned not to cry. "Ma'am, I have nowhere else to go. I've been walking for 5 days to reach this place. The pastor in my village, Father Gregory, he said that St. Margaret's was a place of mercy. That—" "Father Gregory has not stood where I stand," Beatrice interrupted. "He has not had to watch children die because one sick child entered when they should not have. Mercy, young man, must sometimes wear the face of wisdom. Wisdom says you must wait. But where?" The question broke from him, raw and desperate. "Where do I wait? I have no money, no family, nowhere." "That is not my concern." Beatrice's hand moved to close the window. "Rules exist for reasons, and those reasons are written in the graves of children who died because someone thought kindness more important than caution. Return in 2 weeks with a physician's certificate. Until then, you must manage on your own." The window slammed shut with a crack that echoed across the courtyard. Timothy heard the bolt slide home inside, a small sound that nonetheless felt like the closing of a chapter. He stood there for a long moment, rain washing over him, the wooden cross digging into his palm as he squeezed it tighter. Then he turned and walked away from the gates, away from the Gothic spires and the promise of shelter, away from the only hope he had carried across 5 days of walking. The memory of his mother's voice came to him then, soft and steady, as it had been on the last day she could speak. She had pressed this cross into his hand, her fingers cold, but still strong enough to close his around it. "Timothy," she had whispered, her breath labored, "remember that being turned away does not mean being abandoned. Sometimes the path is longer than we expect, but that does not mean we walk it alone. The divine sees every step. Trust in goodness, even when goodness seems absent, especially then." He had not fully understood her words at the time. He understood them even less now, trudging down the muddy road away from the orphanage, his stomach hollow with hunger, and his heart hollower still with rejection. But he kept walking, because walking was all he knew how to do anymore. The landscape beyond the orphanage was a patchwork of autumn browns and greys. Fields lay fallow, waiting for spring. Stone walls divided property from property, and here and there, clusters of bare trees stood like skeletal sentinels. The road was little more than a cart track, rutted and treacherous with rain. Timothy's shoes, second-hand things acquired from a church charity box after his parents died, were already falling apart. The left sole flapped with each step, letting in cold water that squelched between his toes. He ignored it. Pain was a constant companion now, and he had learned that acknowledging it made no difference. By the time the sun began its descent behind heavy clouds, Timothy had found shelter of a sort. There was an old church about 2 miles from the orphanage, abandoned for perhaps 20 years, its roof partially collapsed, and its windows empty sockets in stone walls. Nature had begun reclaiming it. Ivy crawled up the exterior, and moss grew thick on the northern side. But one corner of the structure remained relatively intact, a section of what had once been the vestry, where a piece of roof still kept out most of the rain. Timothy wedged himself into this space, pulling his legs up to his chest to conserve warmth, and tried not to think about how hungry he was. He had eaten his last piece of bread that morning, a heel of rye that had gone stale 3 days prior. Before that, he had subsisted on what he could find, a handful of late berries, a turnip pulled from a farmer's field. He had felt guilty about the theft, but had been too hungry to resist, water from streams. His body was consuming itself now, burning through reserves he did not have. He felt lightheaded, disconnected, as though he might float away if he did not actively hold himself down. As darkness fell, Timothy took out the wooden cross and examined it by the faint light that remained. It was a simple thing, about 4 inches tall, carved from oak. His father had made it 20 years ago, back when he was a young man courting Timothy's mother. He had carved it during long winter evenings, shaping it with care and patience, and had given it to her as a token of his devotion. She had kept it always, through good years and lean ones, through the birth of Timothy and the subsequent stillbirths that had broken her heart over and over, and in her final hour she had passed it to her son. The vertical piece was slightly longer than the horizontal, and where they intersected, his father had carved a tiny rosette, barely visible. Timothy ran his thumb over it now, finding comfort in the familiar texture. This cross was all he had left of them, this and his memories, which grew more painful with each passing day. "Why?" he whispered into the darkness, addressing no one in particular, or perhaps addressing the one his mother had taught him to trust. "Why did they have to die? Why did the fever take them and leave me? Why won't anyone help me?" The ruins offered no answer. Only the wind moaning through empty windows and the drip of water finding its way through cracks in the remaining roof. Timothy curled tighter, tucking the cross against his chest, and eventually exhaustion pulled him into uneasy sleep. He dreamed of the orphanage, of those gates opening wide, of warmth and food and a bed with clean sheets. He dreamed of his mother's smile and his father's laugh, of a time before fever and death, before cold and hunger. And then the dream shifted, growing darker, and he found himself running through shadows, searching for something he could not name, his breath coming in gasps, his heart pounding. He woke to voices, The sun was well up, though still hidden behind persistent clouds. Timothy blinked, disoriented, and then froze as he recognized the urgency in the voices outside the ruined church. There were several people, perhaps 5 or 6, and they were calling a name over and over. Rebecca! Rebecca Ashford! Timothy crept to the edge of his shelter and peered out. He could see them now, men and women, some in work clothes, others in more formal attire, spreading out across the fields and along the road. They carried lanterns even in daylight, the better to peer into ditches and behind walls. One woman was openly weeping. A man with grey whiskers was shouting directions, organizing the searchers into groups. "Check the old mill. Someone go down to the creek. Be careful, the water's high from the rain." Timothy's mind worked quickly. Rebecca Ashford, the director's daughter. He had heard whispers about her in the village where he had stopped 2 days ago. A girl of 7 or 8 years, described as willful and curious, always wandering off. But this sounded more serious than a child playing too far from home. The searchers' voices carried real fear. He should stay hidden. These were not his people, not his concern. The director had turned him away without mercy, had shut the gate in his face and told him to manage on his own. Why should he care if her daughter was missing? But even as he thought this, Timothy knew he could not simply remain in his hiding place. He had been raised better than that. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. Trust in goodness, even when goodness seems absent. He stood brushing dust and moss from his clothes and stepped out into the open. The nearest searcher, a young man with a lantern, spotted him immediately. "You there, boy? Have you seen a little girl? Dark hair, wearing a blue dress, about this tall?" The man held his hand at roughly chest height. Timothy shook his head. "No, sir, I only just woke. I was sheltering in the church. When did she go missing?" "Yesterday evening. Disappeared sometime after supper." "Her mother is beside herself. That's the director of the orphanage up the road. The girl sometimes wanders, but never overnight, never like this." The young man's face was drawn with worry. "If you're willing to help search, we could use every pair of eyes. There are dangerous places around here. Old wells, the quarry, the creek when it's running high like now. Dangerous places." Timothy's mind caught on that phrase. In his 5 days of walking to reach the orphanage, he had passed through varied terrain, and he had learned to read the land the way his father had taught him. He thought of the landscape around the orphanage, of what he had seen in his approach and in his departure yesterday. There was a place, a ravine about a mile east of the orphanage, hidden behind a rise in the land so that you would not see it until you were almost upon it. He had nearly stumbled into it himself. It was perhaps 40 feet deep, its sides steep and covered in loose shale. At the bottom, a thin stream cut through rocks. Not the main creek the searchers were mentioning, but a tributary, swollen now from the rain. And on the near side of the ravine, partially hidden by undergrowth, there was a gap in the earth, the entrance to what might have been an old mine shaft or a natural cave. He had seen it briefly and had given it a wide berth, recognizing danger. But a child, especially one who liked to explore, might not recognize that danger. A child might see an interesting hole and decide to investigate. "Sir," Timothy said, his voice urgent now, "I think I might know where she could be." The young man turned back, hope flickering across his features. "Where?" "There's a ravine east of here. Not the main creek. Smaller. There's a cave or shaft, partially hidden. If the girl was exploring, if she didn't know the area well." The young man's eyes widened. "The old Drake Ravine. Heaven help us, I didn't think we were focusing on the creek and the quarry." He turned and shouted to the others, "Amos, Mr. Pritchard, the boy says there's a ravine to the east with a cave. We need to check it." Within moments the searchers had converged. The man with grey whiskers, Mr. Pritchard apparently, fixed Timothy with a sharp gaze. "You're certain about this ravine, boy?" "Yes, sir. I passed it yesterday. It's hidden by a rise in the land, easy to miss if you don't know it's there. The entrance to the cave is on this side, maybe 20 feet from the edge of the ravine. A child could easily go in thinking it was just a shallow hollow. Mr. Pritchard's jaw tightened. That's the old slate quarry drainage. It goes down at an angle, follows the water. If she went in there... He did not finish the thought. He did not need to. Everyone understood the implications. Right. Samuel, you and Henry come with me. The rest of you keep searching the other areas, in case the boy is wrong. You, boy, you'll guide us. Timothy nodded. Yes, sir. They moved quickly, Mr. Pritchard setting a brisk pace that Timothy struggled to match. His legs were weak from lack of food, and his ruined shoe was now more a hindrance than a help. But he pushed himself, ignoring the protests of his body, focusing only on putting one foot in front of the other. The cross bumped against his ribs in his shirt pocket, a small, hard reminder of his mother's words. The landscape rolled beneath them, fields giving way to scrubland, stone walls crisscrossing the terrain. Timothy led them east, angling slightly north to avoid the worst of the muddy ground. His sense of direction had always been good. Another gift from his father, who had been able to navigate forest and field with uncanny accuracy. Within 20 minutes, they had reached the rise he remembered. Just beyond this, Timothy said, breathing hard. Be careful. The edge is closer than it looks. They crested the rise, and there it was, the ravine. A dark scar in the earth, its sides steep and treacherous. The thin stream at the bottom was indeed swollen, rushing over rocks with a sound like muted thunder. And there, partially obscured by bushes and fallen branches, was the dark mouth of the cave. "Rebecca!" Mr. Pritchard's voice boomed out over the ravine. "Rebecca Ashford, are you there?" For a moment, only the sound of rushing water answered. Then, faint and thin, a voice drifted up from the darkness. "Help! Please, I'm stuck. I can't get out." The men exchanged grim looks. Mr. Pritchard knelt at the cave entrance, peering into the darkness. "Rebecca, it's Mr. Pritchard. Are you hurt?" "My ankle. I fell and I can't—" The girl's voice broke into sobs. "It's dark, and the water is rising, and I'm scared." Samuel, one of the men who had come with them, swore under his breath. "The rain. The drainage is flooding. If she's caught in there and the water keeps rising—" Mr. Pritchard was already removing his coat. "I'll go in. Samuel, you and Henry stay here. If I'm not out in 15 minutes, go back for more help and rope." He started forward, but Timothy saw the problem immediately. Mr. Pritchard was a large man, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest. The entrance to the cave was narrow, perhaps 2 feet wide at its broadest point. Mr. Pritchard might fit, but it would be a squeeze, and if he got stuck— "Sir," Timothy said quietly, "you're too big. You'll wedge yourself in the passage, and then no one can help the girl." Mr. Pritchard turned, frustration and fear warring on his face. "Then what do you suggest, boy? We can't just leave her in there." Timothy looked at the cave mouth, then down at himself. He was small, thin. He could fit through spaces a grown man could not. It was a terrible idea. He knew nothing about caves, nothing about rescue. He was weak from hunger and could barely keep himself upright, let alone help someone else. But he also knew that if they waited for thinner men to arrive, for proper rescue equipment, it might be too late. The girl's voice had held panic, and panic could kill as surely as rising water. He thought of the orphanage gates. He thought of Beatrice Ashford's cold dismissal, her absolute refusal to show mercy. This was her daughter down in that darkness, trapped and terrified. He could walk away. He owed these people nothing. The director had made that clear. Trust in goodness, even when goodness seems absent. Especially then. Timothy took a breath. "I'll go." Mr. Pritchard blinked. "You? Boy, you're just a child yourself, and you look half-starved. I can't ask—" "You're not asking, I'm offering." Timothy pulled the wooden cross from his pocket and held it out to the old man. "Hold this for me. I'll want it back when I return." Mr. Pritchard took the cross, automatically, his fingers closing around the worn wood. For a moment he just stared at Timothy, something shifting in his expression. Then he nodded slowly. "Be careful, son, and talk to her. Keep her calm, if you can." Timothy nodded. Then, before he could think better of it, before fear could root him in place, he dropped to his knees and squeezed into the cave entrance. The passage was tight, almost claustrophobic, and the darkness was absolute. Timothy could feel cold stone pressing in on either side, could hear the echo of his own breathing magnified in the confined space. The floor sloped downward at a sharp angle, and he could feel water trickling beneath him, pooling in low spots. He moved forward on his belly, pushing with his feet, pulling with his hands, feeling his way, because he could see nothing. "Rebecca," he called out. "My name is Timothy. I'm coming to help you. Can you hear me?" "Yes." Her voice was closer now, maybe 20 feet ahead. "Please hurry. The water is getting deeper." Timothy forced himself to move faster, ignoring the scrape of stone against his arms and legs, ignoring the way his heart hammered against his ribs. The passage widened slightly, and he was able to get to his hands and knees. The sound of rushing water was louder here. He must be near where the drainage channel connected to the underground stream. He could feel the current pulling at his hands. "I'm almost there, Rebecca. Keep talking to me. Tell me about yourself." "I'm 7, her voice trembled. "I live at the orphanage. I'm not an orphan, though. My mother is the director. I was exploring yesterday evening, and I found this cave, and I thought it would be fun to see where it went. But then I slipped and fell, and my ankle hurts so much, and I've been here all night, and—" She broke off into sobs. "It's all right," Timothy said, though his own fear was a living thing in his throat. "I've got you now. Just stay where you are." He rounded a bend in the passage, and suddenly there was light. Not much, just a faint glow filtering down through a crack in the stone above. It was enough to see by. The cave had opened into a small chamber, perhaps 8 feet across. A thin stream ran through it, the water already shin-deep and rising, and there, wedged against the far wall, was a small figure in a torn and muddy blue dress. Rebecca Ashford was indeed 7 years old, with dark hair that hung in wet tangles around her face. Her eyes were enormous with fear, and she was shivering violently. Her left ankle was bent at an angle that made Timothy wince. Broken or badly sprained, certainly. "Hello, Rebecca," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm Timothy. I'm going to get you out of here, all right?" She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "It hurts." "I know." Timothy crawled closer, assessing the situation. The chamber had 2 exits, the passage he had come through, and a narrow gap where the stream disappeared, probably continuing down to the ravine below. The water was definitely rising. In another hour, this entire chamber would be flooded. He needed to move quickly. "Rebecca, I need you to hold very still while I look at your ankle. Can you do that?" She nodded again, biting her lip. Timothy examined the injury as carefully as he could in the dim light. It was swollen, already turning purple, but the bone did not appear to be protruding. That was good. He could work with that. "I'm going to lift you," he said. "It's going to hurt. I'm sorry." "It's all right," she whispered. "Just please get me out." Timothy positioned himself, trying to figure out the best way to carry a child through a narrow, sloping passage when he himself was barely stronger than she was. In the end, he crouched low and guided Rebecca onto his back, her thin arms around his neck, her injured leg dangling. "Hold on tight," he said. "Don't let go, no matter what." She held on. Timothy began to crawl back the way he had come, moving slowly now, carefully, testing each handhold before committing his weight. Rebecca was light, too light actually, which suggested she had not been eating well even before this ordeal. But even her small weight was significant when added to his own exhaustion. His arms shook, his legs cramped. The water pulled at his hands, trying to drag him off balance. The passage seemed longer on the return journey, endless and suffocating. At one point, Timothy's hand slipped on wet stone, and he nearly fell. Rebecca gasped but did not scream, her grip tightening around his neck. He found purchase again, breathed hard, kept moving. "Tell me something," he said, needing the distraction as much as she probably did. "What do you like to do? When you're not exploring dangerous caves, I mean." A shaky laugh. I like to read and I like to help Mr. Harding in the garden. He grows vegetables for the orphanage. He lets me pick beans sometimes. That sounds nice. Do you like the other children at the orphanage? Most of them. Some are sad all the time, though. Mother says they've had hard lives. She says we have to be patient with them. Timothy thought of Beatrice Ashford's cold refusal at the gate, her absolute dismissal. It was hard to reconcile that woman with someone who counselled patience. But perhaps there was more to her than he had seen in that brief, terrible encounter. "Your mother sounds wise," he said, because it seemed the thing to say. "She is," Rebecca agreed. "She's strict, but she's fair. And she loves me very much. She must be so worried." Guilt flickered through Timothy, though he could not have said why. He pushed it aside and focused on moving forward, one hand, then the other, one knee, then the next. The wooden cross was waiting for him outside. His mother's voice was in his memory. Trust in goodness. He was not sure how long the journey took. Time lost meaning in the darkness, measured only in the burning of muscles and the rasp of breath. But eventually he saw light ahead, real light, daylight filtering in through the cave entrance. He heard voices, Mr. Pritchard shouting encouragement. "That's it, boy, just a bit more. We've got you." Timothy felt hands grip his shoulders, pulling him forward. He emerged into blessed open air, Rebecca still clinging to his back. Mr. Pritchard and the other men carefully disentangled the girl, and Timothy collapsed onto the wet grass, his chest heaving, his whole body trembling with exhaustion. Someone wrapped a blanket around him. Someone else pressed a flask to his lips. Water, cool and clean. He drank greedily, then lay still, staring up at the grey sky. Rebecca was crying, but they were tears of relief now. Mr. Pritchard was examining her ankle with gentle hands, murmuring reassurances. "Broken, I think, but it will heal. You'll be all right, little miss. You'll be all right." "Is the boy well?" Rebecca asked, her voice small. "The boy who saved me?" "I'm fine," Timothy managed, though he was not entirely sure that was true. "Just tired." Mr. Pritchard looked over at him, and there was something in the old man's eyes that had not been there before. Respect, perhaps, or wonder. "You're more than fine, son. You're a blessed miracle. If you hadn't known about this ravine, if you hadn't been brave enough to go in after her—" He did not finish. He did not need to. They made a makeshift stretcher from coats and branches, settling Rebecca onto it with care. Mr. Pritchard handed the wooden cross back to Timothy, pressing it into his palm with a solemnity that felt almost ceremonial. "Guard this well, son," he said quietly. "A boy who carries such faith is a rare thing." Timothy closed his fingers around the cross, feeling its familiar contours, finding comfort in the touch. He nodded, too tired for words. The journey back to the orphanage took longer than the outward trip. Word had spread quickly, and by the time they reached the gates, a crowd had gathered, searchers returning from other areas, orphanage staff, curious villagers, and standing in the center of it all, her face white as chalk, was Beatrice Ashford. She ran forward the moment she saw the stretcher, her composure shattering like glass. "Rebecca! Oh, Rebecca, my darling girl!" She fell to her knees beside the makeshift stretcher, her hands hovering over her daughter as though afraid to touch her, afraid she might disappear. "Are you hurt? What happened?" "Oh, my precious child." "I'm all right, Mother," Rebecca said, though her voice was weak with pain and exhaustion. "I fell in a cave and hurt my ankle, but I'm all right. The boy saved me. Timothy. He crawled in and carried me out." Beatrice Ashford looked up, her eyes searching the crowd. They found Timothy standing at the edge of the group, muddy and exhausted, the wooden cross still clutched in his hand. For a long moment she simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she stood, slowly, as though her legs barely supported her, and walked toward him. Timothy braced himself. He did not know what to expect. Gratitude, perhaps, or dismissal, or that same cold judgment from before. What he did not expect was what actually happened. Beatrice Ashford stopped before him, and her iron control crumbled completely. She reached out, hesitated, then pulled Timothy into an embrace, her whole body shaking with sobs. "Thank you," she whispered against his hair, her voice breaking. "Thank you, thank you, thank you. You saved her. You saved my daughter. How can I ever—" She pulled back, her face wet with tears, her hands gripping his shoulders. "You're the boy from yesterday, the one I turned away, Mr. Brennan?" "Timothy." "Yes, ma'am." His voice was barely audible. She closed her eyes, fresh tears escaping. When she opened them again, there was pain there and shame and something that might have been understanding. "I was afraid," she said quietly. "Yesterday when you came to the gate. I was so afraid of the fever, of losing more children. We lost 3 2 years ago to sickness. I watched them die. I promised myself I would never let that happen again, that I would be vigilant, that I would enforce every rule, every precaution. I thought that was strength. I thought that was wisdom." She drew a shaky breath. "But I see now that I let fear harden me. I saw a sick boy who might infect my orphans. I didn't see a child who needed help. I saw a problem to be solved, a risk to be eliminated. I didn't see a human being." Timothy did not know what to say. The anger he might have felt, the bitterness, seemed distant now, insignificant in the face of this moment. Beatrice looked past him to where Rebecca lay on the stretcher, then back to his face. "You could have walked away. I turned you away with cruelty, and you would have been justified in doing the same to me. But you didn't. You risked your life for a child you didn't know, whose mother had shown you nothing but harshness. Why?" Timothy looked down at the wooden cross in his hand. He thought of his mother, of her last words, of the faith she had tried to pass to him. Trust in goodness, even when goodness seems absent, especially then. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "Because she needed help. Because—" He paused, searching for words. "Because if we only help people who've been kind to us, if we only show mercy to those who've shown us mercy, then what does that say about us? My mother taught me that goodness isn't conditional. It just is. We do the right thing because it's right, not because we expect something in return." Silence fell over the crowd. Even Rebecca had stopped crying, staring at Timothy with wide, wondering eyes. Beatrice Ashford's face worked through a dozen emotions: shame, grief, awe, and something that looked almost like gratitude. "Your mother," she said at last, her voice thick with emotion, "was a very wise woman." She was. Timothy felt his own tears now, hot and sudden. "I miss her." Beatrice pulled him into another embrace, and this time Timothy did not resist. He leaned into her warmth, into the comfort of an adult's presence, and allowed himself to cry for the first time since his parents had died. He cried for his loss, for his loneliness, for his exhaustion and fear. He cried for the rejection at the gate and for the terror in the cave. He cried, and Beatrice held him, this stern woman who had learned that sometimes mercy requires admitting you were wrong. When the tears finally subsided, she pulled back and looked at him seriously. "Mr. Brennan, Timothy, I was wrong to turn you away. I was cruel and I was foolish. I cannot undo that. But I can offer you something now, if you'll accept it. St. Margaret's Orphanage has a place for you. Not in 2 weeks, not after examinations and certifications. Now, today, you have proven yourself to be a child of remarkable character and courage. We would be honored to have you." Timothy looked at her, then at the gates beyond, those massive wooden doors that had been closed against him just yesterday. They stood open now, and through them he could see the orphanage courtyard, warm and welcoming. He could see other children gathered there, watching with curious eyes. He could see the promise of shelter, of food, of belonging. He looked down at the wooden cross one more time, then tucked it carefully back into his pocket, against his heart where it belonged. When he looked up again, he was smiling, tired, tentative, but genuine. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I would like that very much." Beatrice smiled back, and it transformed her face, softening the harsh lines, revealing the woman beneath the armor. She took his hand, dirty and scratched as it was, and led him toward the gates. Behind them, the crowd parted respectfully, and someone started clapping. Others joined in, until the applause was a wave of sound washing over Timothy, acknowledging not just his bravery, but something deeper. The truth that mercy and sacrifice have power beyond measure, that goodness given freely can change hearts and open doors that seemed forever closed. As they crossed the threshold into the orphanage courtyard, Beatrice paused and looked down at Timothy. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, "about why I was so afraid. About what I couldn't say yesterday because I didn't think you deserved an explanation." She gestured for him to sit on a stone bench near the entrance, and she sat beside him, still holding his hand. Rebecca had been carried inside to be tended by the orphanage's nurse, and the crowd had dispersed, leaving them in relative privacy. 23 years ago, Beatrice began, her voice low, I had 2 daughters. Rebecca, whom you saved, and an older girl named Elizabeth. She would be 31 now if she had lived. Her voice caught. Elizabeth was 9 years old when a boy came to our gates. He was sick with scarlet fever, though we didn't know it at the time. He seemed merely tired and claimed to have traveled far. I let him in. I was younger then, idealistic. I believed that an orphanage should never turn away a child in need, no matter the circumstances. She paused, staring at her hands. Within a week, 12 children were sick. Within 2 weeks, 3 were dead. My Elizabeth among them. She was so beautiful, so full of life, and then she was gone, taken by a disease I had allowed through these gates out of misplaced compassion. Timothy's throat tightened. I'm sorry. I blamed myself, Beatrice continued. My husband, Rebecca's father, couldn't bear it. He left us, said he couldn't look at me without seeing Elizabeth's grave. So I was alone, with a baby daughter and 40 orphans depending on me, and I promised myself it would never happen again. I would be hard. I would be unmerciful if mercy meant risking more lives. I would protect these children, even if it meant turning away others who needed help. She turned to look at Timothy, her eyes bright with unshed tears. For 23 years, I kept that promise. I turned away dozens of children, maybe hundreds, always for good reasons. Disease, overcrowding, lack of resources, always justified by rules and regulations. But yesterday, when I looked through that window and saw you standing in the rain, I didn't see a boy who needed shelter. I saw the boy who had killed my daughter, and I shut the gate on him again, as I wished I had done all those years ago. She reached up and touched his face gently. But you are not that boy. You are Timothy Brennan, who carries his mother's faith and his father's courage. And today you showed me something I had forgotten, that goodness is not about calculating risks and making safe choices. Goodness is about doing what is right, even when it costs you, even when you have every reason to turn away. You saved my daughter despite what I did to you. That is grace. That is mercy. That is everything I forgot in my fear. Timothy did not know what to say. The story was too big, too tragic, and his tired mind struggled to hold all of it. But he understood the core of it, that this stern woman had been broken by loss, had spent decades trying to prevent it from happening again, and in doing so had lost sight of the very compassion that had led her to run an orphanage in the first place. I think, he said slowly, that my mother would say you did the best you could. That fear is understandable when you've lost someone you love. But she would also say, he paused, reaching for the right words, she would say that the answer to being hurt is not to stop caring, it's to care anyway, even though it's scary, maybe especially because it's scary. Beatrice laughed, a broken sound that was half sob. Your mother was wiser than I am. She made mistakes too, Timothy said. She told me so near the end. She said everyone does. But she said what matters is whether you learn from them, whether you let them make you bitter or better. Beatrice pulled him close again, and they sat there in the courtyard as the afternoon light began to fade. Two people who had both lost so much, finding comfort in each other's presence. Over the days and weeks that followed, Timothy began to settle into life at St. Margaret's. He was given a bed in the boys' dormitory, clean clothes that fit properly, and regular meals that slowly filled out his thin frame. He made friends among the other orphans, children who had lost parents to fever, to accidents, to poverty and war. He helped Mr. Harding in the garden, as Rebecca had described, and found peace in the simple work of tending growing things. Rebecca's ankle healed slowly, but well. The break had been clean, and with proper rest and care, she was soon hobbling around on crutches, then walking with a cane, and finally running through the courtyard as though nothing had ever happened. She appointed herself Timothy's particular friend, following him around and telling anyone who would listen about how brave he had been in the cave. Beatrice Ashford changed too. The iron control remained. She was still the director, still responsible for the welfare of 40-some children, but there was a warmth now that had been absent before. She smiled more. She was quicker to offer comfort and slower to enforce rules that served no real purpose. She began accepting more children, trusting her judgment more and her fear less. One evening, perhaps a month after Timothy's arrival, Beatrice found him in the small chapel attached to the orphanage. He was sitting in the front pew, the wooden cross in his hands, staring at the simple altar. She sat beside him quietly. "Do you pray?" she asked. Timothy nodded. "Sometimes. I'm not sure if I do it right." "I don't think there is a right way," Beatrice said. "I think it's more about the heart than the words." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Timothy said, "I was thinking about something my mother told me, about paths being longer than we expect. When I was standing at those gates, when you shut them in my face, I thought the path had ended. I thought there was no hope left." "But," Beatrice prompted gently, "but the path just went around a different way. Through the rain and the ruined church and the cave, it was harder than I expected. It hurt more, but it led here eventually, and maybe—" He paused, thinking. "Maybe it needed to be that way. Maybe if you had let me in right away, I never would have known about the ravine. Rebecca would have died, and you and I never would have had this conversation." Beatrice was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "Are you saying you're grateful I turned you away?" "No," Timothy said honestly. "It hurt. I was angry and scared and hungry. But I'm saying that sometimes the long path teaches us things the short path doesn't. And maybe that's worth something." Beatrice reached over and took his hand. "You are a remarkable boy, Timothy Brennan. Your parents raised you well." "They tried," Timothy said, squeezing her hand back. "And now you're trying too. So I think I'll be all right." Later that night, as Timothy lay in his bed in the dormitory, listening to the breathing of the other children around him, he took out the wooden cross one more time. He ran his thumb over the tiny rosette where the vertical and horizontal pieces met, feeling the smooth wood worn by his mother's hands and his father's craftsmanship. Trust in goodness, even when goodness seems absent, especially then. He understood now, as he had not understood before, what his mother had meant. Goodness was not a reward for being kind. It was not a transaction, something you gave only to those who deserved it. Goodness was something you carried inside you, something you offered freely, even when, especially when, you had every reason not to. He had been turned away, rejected, left to fend for himself in the rain. And he had chosen, in the moment of decision, to help anyway, not because he expected gratitude or reward, but because a child needed saving, and he could do it. That simple, that profound. The cross had been in his pocket when he crawled into that cave. It had pressed against his ribs as he carried Rebecca through the darkness. It had been his talisman, his reminder, his connection to the parents he had lost. And somehow, in saving one child, he had found his way home. He tucked the cross under his pillow and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments to orphanage life. But tonight, he was warm and fed and safe. He had a bed, a place, a purpose. He had been denied at the gates, and 2 days later he had saved the director's child. The path had been longer and harder than he had expected, but it had led him exactly where he needed to be. In the darkness, Timothy smiled. Then, for the first time since his parents had died, he slept deeply and without dreams, the wooden cross keeping watch beneath his pillow, and the promise of tomorrow waiting in the light that would come with dawn. The story of the boy who was turned away became in time a legend at St. Margaret's Orphanage. New children arriving would hear it from the older ones, told with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. Some versions had Timothy descending into a bottomless pit. Others had him fighting off wild animals to reach Rebecca, but the core remained the same. A boy showed mercy to those who had shown him none, and in doing so changed everything. Years later, when Timothy was a young man preparing to leave the orphanage and make his own way in the world, Beatrice would pull him aside one last time. She would press something into his hand, a key, bronze and old, the key to the orphanage gates. "Keep this," she would say, "as a reminder that gates can close and gates can open. But what matters most is what we carry inside us when we stand before them. You carried your mother's wisdom and your father's courage and your own generous heart. Those are the keys that open the doors that matter most." And Timothy would close his fingers around that key, feeling its weight, understanding its symbolism. He would carry it with him always, along with the wooden cross, 2 talismans from 2 chapters of his life. Reminders that rejection is not the end of the story, that goodness, given freely, has power beyond measure, and that sometimes the longest paths lead us home. But that was years in the future. For now, in this moment, Timothy was simply a boy who had found shelter after a storm, who had been broken and made whole, who had learned that mercy given is mercy received, and that the most profound acts of faith are often the simplest, just doing the right thing, even when everything tells you not to, even when goodness seems absent, especially then.